But you are in for another treat here with our Climate Displacement and Migration panel. I'm going to be moderating, and we have 4 outstanding panelists, and we are essentially going to give you a global tour of sorts of this pressing challenge in the climate change and human rights space. The more I've worked on climate displacement and migration issues, the more I see it as something that requires much more attention at all levels of governance. This is a problem that's happening now. It's getting worse, and it's going to get ahead of us if the law doesn't recognize it and provide some strategies to get ahead of it. So we are going to begin the panel with each panelist just briefly introducing their relationship to this work and their regional focus. And then we are going to proceed essentially from the farthest region to bringing it back home, progressing from South Asia to Middle East and North Africa to the Americas, and then very close to home, Charleston, South Carolina, as a primary focus for our last presenter on the panel. So without further ado, I'd like each of the panelists to just give a few sentences on their background and experience on these issues and in what geographical context they've been working. Try it.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chaya Bharadwaj, and I'm going to be focusing on climate migration in South Asia. South Asia is a conglomeration of 8 countries: India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. They are not in any order of population or alphabet, so on and so forth, but they form part of a conglomeration that I will be talking about. Because I come from India, my research is focused on climate change migration in South Asia, but I've also worked extensively across climate-related migration in Americas, Africas, and Asia. And super excited to discuss what I'll be speaking about and learn more from the audience. Thank you.
I'm Omar Al-Khataibi from Amman, Jordan. I'm a lawyer since 1993, and I'm Vice President of a Climate Change and Climate Change Association in Jordan. At the same time as I'm a Senior Legal Fellow at CISDL, International Center for Sustainable Development Law at Miguel. At the same time, I have experience with immigration and climate change immigration since 1995. I think that's the time which I present now. Good evening for everybody.
Hi, folks. My name is Camila Bustos, she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor of law at the Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law at Pace University. And my work intersects, it looks at the intersection of climate change, human rights, and migration. I worked for a year or so as a consultant with the International Refugee Assistance Project, IRAP, you might have heard of it. Continue to work with them in a more collegial capacity now, and I'm excited to talk to you about the Americas. The Americas is a big region, so then I'll do a case study on Colombia.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Susan Crawford. I'm an American trained lawyer. Can't help it. I grew up here in Washington, actually, as a lawyer. I was a partner at Wilmer Cutler, which is now Wilmer Hale. I spent 20 years in tech policy, especially focused on internet access, turning to climate in about 2018. You may say, why? Well, the through line of my career has been, what is government good for? What public goods of safety and welfare for its citizens is it obligated to provide? And I'm studying that now in the context of climate adaptation. I'm teaching a course called The Law of Climate Adaptation at Harvard. And it is the focus of my life to try to bring all of these strands together for you in a short presentation about both Bangladesh and Charleston. So more later.
So you can see we have a very distinguished and wide range of experience across our panelists, so really excited to hear what they have to share with you, and then, of course, make sure we have time for Q&A to get a good dialogue going. So Chaya, you're up.
All right, thank you. The first panel was definitely thought-provoking and started a lot of conversations amongst us all. And I sort of heard a lot of buzzwords. The words that I heard a lot were narratives, language, translation, participation, support system, climate change, and law. And I think through my presentation, I'm trying to address all of these because climate change and migration, especially from the developing world, encompasses a lot of those, but still fails. But still, the system fails in a way to provide protection for people who actually need protection. And so, climate change and migration. And so, climate change and migration is primarily a question of science attribution. Climate change is all about science. IPCC started, we started learning about science, so on and so forth. Science is too complex. I still don't understand a lot of words the people in chemistry or physics related to climate change talk about. And that makes it difficult to communicate about climate change to the people who are actually affected by it. So it's a question of science attribution. The second theme related to climate migration is that it is a knowledge system that is currently, or at least in my opinion, is dominated by a West knowledge system or West dominant knowledge system. What I mean by that is that a lot of narratives or a lot of knowledge from the developing world, especially concerning climate change migration, doesn't find validation at the international level, and therefore is a cause of a great gap between what lies into what is actually happening on the ground, what protection do these people need, and what protection is really being given to them. And the last question, which sort of, again, entangles the whole theme of climate change and migration, is related to economics of migration. And every time you hear about, oh, migrants, most migration-related narratives or most migrant-related language is fixated on economics of it, or most migrants are considered to be economic migrants in one way or the other. Now coming back or putting them into a circle together, I just want to highlight that because science is not clear, or perhaps the scientists are not able to communicate it to the people or policymakers or lawmakers or litigators who actually want to bring about a change in it, it is causing other related issues. That is the problem of integrating the knowledge systems of the developing world and the dominant knowledge systems of the West, if I can use that term, that exist today. And secondly, it is also leading to the narrative of economic migrants dominating any other migrant story or migrant narrative that can be brought out. Before I move to the next slide, just want to highlight, for example, if today assumingly, I'm fortunately not affected by climate change as much because I think I'm privileged enough to live in a very landlocked urban setup. But assumingly, if I was affected by a climate change extreme event today, and if I was to apply for protection in any of the country outside, or even if I was to apply or seek protection in my own country, the question of climate science, economic migrants, and the knowledge system will be put to test. And because of conflicting narratives on, whether this particular event was triggered by climate change or not, whether it was not, but because climate change event or non-climate change event like a disaster or a flood ruined your economy, and now because you don't have anything to rely upon for your livelihood, you're automatically termed as an economic migrant. And so the overall idea that climate change today can be both a direct trigger or a direct driver of migration, but also climate change can be an indirect driver of migration, is causing a lot of trouble in really giving legitimacy to the narratives of climate migrants, especially those who are coming from developing world. And I can give you examples of climate-related migration. Of course, the Pakistan floods of 2021 are perhaps the most accepted climate-related migration event. But I can assure you, there are definitely scientists who would disagree if I tried to characterize the floods of 2021 in Pakistan as a climate change-related event. And yes, those are Pakistan floods, and the two pictures, the second picture also talks about the migration that is happening in Bangladesh or Bay of Bengal. I want to highlight that India in 1980s saw one of the very first recorded islands in last 50 years that actually completely submerged because of alleged climate change, or alleged sea level rise, or alleged coastal erosion, or alleged anthropogenic events. Why I'm using the term alleged is because scientists couldn't agree if it was triggered by climate change or not. Now, because scientists couldn't agree, the people of these submerged islands haven't been able to receive the protection they might deserve. And there are stories right now where people of this particular island were relocated to the nearest island in 1980s, between 1980s to early 2000s. But that nearest island is on the brink of submergence now. So in their lifetime, this is one particular community that would have experienced climate change or environmental related migration twice in their lifetime, and will be affected twice in their lifetime. Now, these are the stories that the scientists try to communicate at the international forums, but are not able to. Other examples of climate-related migration would include the migration that is happening in Maldives because of and Sri Lanka because of sea level rise and coastal erosion, and will also encapsulate, at least as far as my understanding of climate-related migration goes, projects which are aimed at promoting climate mitigation efforts. So renewable energy projects like hydroelectricity power plants or renewable energy projects like wind turbines are also causing a lot of displacement in these developing countries. Currently, these displacements are not talked often as a climate-related migration. And so that is another problem of the language or the narrative or the terminology, and then at the end of the day, the protection that follows under the law. So what are the impacts at the regional level in this context? The large impacts are human rights related, because these people are from vulnerable communities, low-income communities, or low-status communities. They are in a vicious cycle of exploitation, vulnerability, low income, exploitation, vulnerability, and low income, and they're not able to find the protections that they need. So the protections may or may not flow from largely right to life, right to healthy environment, which exist in most of these 8 developing countries from South Asia that I'm talking about. But that is their only chance. So the human rights mechanisms that exist right now are their only chance to actually even think about protections. And so the protections are really human rights based. And the second impact that is related is the regional or the local impact. And when I talk about regional local impact, I'm saying really both economic impact and the political impact that follows. Now, because a lot of migration is happening within the porous borders, meaning from one country to another, the people who may be forced to move because of climate change factors are automatically titled or automatically labeled as economic migrants. And when a person is labeled as an economic migrant, the psychological and political effect of it is that the person is a lot of times can be seen as a threat to the local economic resources. And the language that follows is that an economic migrant may or may not be an economic burden on the state, on the receiving state that it goes to. So these are very complex social, political, and psychological factors that play a role there. Yes, all of these rights are then related. I will not go into the details of these rights. And these are challenges and considerations, meaning, yes, the courts can be approached, bilateral, multilateral treaties can be formulated, there can be a lot of negotiation, cooperation. We can also look at common but differentiated responsibilities. Of course, all of these mechanisms are already existing. And most lawyers sitting in the audience in this forum might also be aware of these. The challenge, however, that then again, primary challenge that lies in what the last panel was also talking about, which is how do the narratives, the language, and the implementation of these narratives and languages play a role in the implementation of the existing mechanism that I'm talking about. And I'll give you an example. An example of it is characterization of people who migrated from Louisiana to more mainland were characterized as climate refugees in the US. Now, climate refugees is again a very technical term in law, and refugees only mean people who migrate from one country to another country. And so this then creates a challenge on the legal and policy forum. But I want to conclude my presentation, and I'm not able to cover all of it, but I just want to conclude my presentation by saying that in all the buzzwords that we've discussed today, narratives, language, translation, support system, financial systems, climate change and law, I want to add another term to the buzzwords that we are talking about, and that another term is intention. And so we need intention of the policymakers, the lawmakers, the implementers, the youth activists, to actually intend to say, protect people who are affected by climate change, or to engage in climate action. And I'm focused on intention because if there's no intention, then the law will never happen. The confusion will remain, and we can't even begin talking about implementation in that context. So I'll end my presentation with that. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Chaya. That was a great way to kick off our panel, and it reminds me to kind of highlight a few themes that are really important as you continue to hear the remaining presentations, and Chaya alluded to these points. As someone who's worked on this topic for probably about 7 or 8 years now, I saw the terminological issues about this challenge 10 years ago, and we're still confronting them. So that refers to the notion of, is climate refugee the right term to talk about this sort of reality of displacement that we're seeing? Other terms in the literature are climate displaced peoples, climate migrants. They each have different implications that are both positive and potentially distracting or not helpful. So when you think about climate migrants, it implies some volition, and that might not really be what's happening when people are being forcibly displaced from where they live because of climate-related factors. It might not be accurate to call them migrants, which suggests volition. And then climate refugees is a bit of a misnomer because we have existing human rights law that defines refugees in a very specific way that does not map very well to forcibly displaced people because of climate change factors. The traditional notion of a refugee is those who are choosing to leave what they call home because they feel persecuted on the basis of political, religious, social reasons. And they choose not to return to their homeland because they don't feel welcome. And that's not what's going on with climate refugees, being forced out and unable to return in most instances. Another reality is just how big this problem is. So we have simultaneous challenges across the globe on transboundary displacement, which is really quite daunting when you think about the international law and international human rights dimensions of a country that has a significant part of its population, or perhaps all of its population, moving from what used to be home, a recognized nation state, to somewhere else because they can no longer live where they formerly were as a nation state in a South Pacific island, for instance. So there's massive international law implications there. But even on an internal basis, the internally displaced communities we're seeing around the world because of climate-forced displacement, those are massive, and we're seeing those across the U.S. certainly and around the world. And so it is an issue that does not discriminate, basically. The global north and the global south are both confronting internal displacement challenges that the law does not really have answers for yet. How do we address these? Even on a very small scale, we've had very imperfect solutions to climate displacement, as we heard from Professor Verchik last night in the case of an indigenous community in Louisiana, a very small one that was displaced because of climate change. So, and then Chaya alerted to another kind of more technical reality of what makes this problem so challenging, and that is, what does it mean to be displaced by climate-related factors? How do we separate that out? Because there is more than just climate that typically is forcing communities to move from one place to another. There are economic, there are social, there are political factors that are also at play in the background. And so how does the law identify what it means to be climate displaced and when those other factors are swirling around in the background? It's a massive legal challenge. The more I think about it, the more I think I don't know how we're going to get ahead of this, especially when it's not getting nearly the attention it deserves at the annual COP meetings. Climate migration barely gets in the conversation, which is crazy. This is something that the global community has known about for more than a decade now. So with that sobering note, we'll turn things over to Omar.
Thank you, Dr. Dani. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you for the faculty of our law of school at George Washington University. And thank you for all of yours who attend this session. I want to start by a story related to immigration, climate change immigration. In 1995, I was a young lawyer. At that time, my friend talked to me that his wife, she was illegally at Jordan. And after 5 years of marriage, she needed the documents for her children to go for the school. They want papers for birthday, and he cannot do that because she is illegal at Jordan. At that time, I understand there is something which is calling climate change immigration because she came from Syria to Jordan without documents and illegally. I start my profession with this story. After a few months, I discovered there is more than 10,000 persons in Jordan without documents, without ID, without any information about them. For that, I start to do my best to serve these people to get their documents from the authority in Jordan. Anyway, I want to go for the past. As you know, our region in Middle East, especially Jordan, where I based, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, they are relative. And the most of the area is desert. There's a lack of raining. And we face many climate change problems in our area. At the same time, the people or the countries, Syria and Iraq, they depend on Al-Furat and Dijla rivers, which comes from Turkey to their countries. Sometimes this river, the water is low, and other times it's up. For that, they face also a climate change immigration if they didn't have water. And if they have more of water, they will face the same problem. As we are Arab countries, we are in regional convention or agreement as we are in Arab Union. They sometimes came to Jordan. Sometimes some of them, they go for Iraq or for Saudi Arabia. This area in the west of Saudi Arabia, east of Jordan, south of Syria, it is open area. After we have the border between our countries, there was a problem for the immigration because every country, they wanna talk about their relative only without the others in other countries. In 1923, the Jordanian government issued the law of 1923 for nationality, and they treat all the people who are in the Jordanian area as Jordanian. This was the first time to solve the problem of the climate change refugees who came from other countries to our country. At 1948, we have another also a crisis in the area. The most of Palestine came to Jordan. For that, there was issued the law of nationality at 1949. They give the people the passport only, without nationality. At 1945, there was issued the nationality law, and they give the Palestinian refugees who came from West Bank to Jordan the nationality also. At 1960, there was a climate change immigration from Syria and Iraq and Syria and Saudi Arabia, and there was 6 strong families, which they based on Jordan in this time. The government, they issued and amended the law of 1954, and they give the nationality for these 6 families. In 1989, we faced the problem and the crisis between Iraq and Kuwait. The most of the people in Kuwait, they traveled to Jordan because it's safe. And in 2003, the most of the people in Iraq, they traveled from Iraq to Jordan. There was more than 500,000 refugees from Iraq to Jordan. At 2010, there was the crisis in Syria. It was, I'm talking now about political crisis, but at the same time, there is another side for this crisis, which is a climate change, because we have a pressure in all the surfaces in the country, and all our resources now divided for all the peoples. In 2010, we have about 600,000 refugees from Syria, they based in Jordan. This is the announced number from UNHCR. Unfortunately, there was more than 1,400,000 persons who didn't register with UNHCR because they didn't want to do a crisis with their system in Syria. In all these stages, during this stage, we have the main important thing. It was in 2009 when we faced a problem with refugees in Jordan who came to the country without documents, and they face many difficulties in their life. The UNHCR called us as Jordan Bar Association, and they asked us to hold a conference about this problem. I was the representative of the Jordan Bar Association in that time. We have legal problems also because Geneva agreement in 1951, they didn't include the immigration, climate change as a result of a treatment to this convention. For that, we didn't have any provision in law to protect those people who came to our country. At the same time, Jordan, they didn't sign the Geneva Convention in 1951 because we have another obligation by the UNRWA as there is a lot on Jordan about the Palestinian refugees. For that, after the conference, we studied all the legal cases. We find that the UNHCR held agreement with Interior Ministry in Jordan to find a way how we can protect these peoples and how we can issue a paper for them. We depend on this agreement, and we start to correct their situation in Jordan one by one, and we constitute a team of lawyers with agreement with UNHCR, and I think we pleading in more than 10,000 cases who are for the people and persons who didn't have documents and they face problems in the courts. Especially that there is, in our countries, in Jordan, if you cross the border without documents, you will pay about 500 GD. Anyway, it's good, but in other countries, this will take you for the jail. And we have also, as a lawyer, a problem because we are responsible for our signing on the power of attorney for any person. If he said, I am Omar, but he is not Omar, I will go for the jail, and I will be refused from my professional association because this is my responsibility. This is the main problems that we face. For that, I think we have to talk about these challenges which faces the lawyers, how to be satisfied with the judge, how to be satisfied with the authority that you are pleading about some person. He is not Jordanian. He is not recognized by the government, and how you can give him the right to be on your land, in your country, as a human right. We depend on the human right declare and also the human rights economic declare as one of the points that we start to defend about these peoples. I have some recommendations. Firstly, the necessity of concluding an international agreement, the governance and regulates climate-related asylum. 2, creating a specialized international fund to solve pre-asylum problems, meaning solving the problems of countries or parts of the countries that are exposed to climate conditions that lead to migration as a preventive measure to prevent the climate migration. 3, establish international center and a regional center for food and medicine, developing the food chain, reducing food losses and wasting, and directing it to the targeted poor migrants to contribute to solving the climate-related refugees crisis and improving rain seeding system to alleviate desertification and environmental problems, urging neighboring countries as a regional system to establish emergency funds to confront climate migration and alleviate suffering. Supporting legal efforts by ISO, local legislation that addresses the problems of a climate-related asylum, reducing, mitigating emissions that lead to climate change, establish an international fund for legal and judicial assistance specifically for climate refugees, encouraging scientific research and training to migration issues as a result of a climate change. Anyway, this is my experience as a lawyer, but I have also as academic my thesis, which was issued by the Journal of Politics and Law Achieves, volume number 7, 2014, guarantees the protection of the rights of Syrian refugees in Jordan. Thank you for listening.
Well, this panel is exceptional on many levels, but first and foremost, I'll observe that the first two panelists actually stayed within their allotted time, which is unheard of in academia. So I just wanted to make some quick observations. Omar raised a lot of really important issues regarding climate migration and how it happens and how we can respond. So the first thing I would note is that one of the reasons why Omar is here to join us today is that he's been observing and working on these issues almost as long as they've been recognized as happening. When you think about 1992 as the demarcation point when the global community came together on governing climate change with the UNFCCC agreement, you heard from Omar that by the mid-90s he was already observing these climate-related displacement realities in Jordan. And there aren't many people who can say that they've been thinking about and working on the issues for that long in the climate migration space. It really got much more attention, perhaps post-2010. So those observations alone are highly valuable in the timeline he provided for the regional conflicts related to the climate migration problem. And then one thing that struck me throughout the remarks is how climate change is known as a threat multiplier. And that's perhaps no better evidence of that reality than in the Middle East. So the Middle East is really an area of tremendous political and cultural conflict already had faced food and water insecurity issues well before we knew about climate change. And climate change is just compounding all of that in a way that's very, very dangerous and very, very imminent. And so I think those anecdotes that Omar shared were quite really valuable evidence of this reality, how it's just like it's going from a slow drip to a deluge about how this could escalate very, very quickly in very dangerous ways for the region and the world when you think about the potential for armed conflict to resolve some of those challenges. And then in terms of legal responses and solutions, I heard a reference to the idea of an international agreement, which I think is nearly impossible when you think about how fast this crisis is moving and how long an international agreement takes to come into being, at minimum 10 years or more to get a meaningful international environmental, international human rights agreement drafted and implemented. We don't have that kind of time. So I fear that this is going to be one of those many problems that we're just going to throw money at. We're going to address it a little bit at a time. And of course, money is an important part of the solution, but not nearly the whole solution. And so I worry about this kind of problem being something that money gets thrown at after the fact, because the best way the law can intervene is to help people stay where they are and get ahead of that, preventing the harsh impacts of climate migration, and not just throwing people life preservers when they've been displaced and somehow minimizing the damage they've already suffered. So in that regard, another interesting legal question is the obligations of host countries. You know, these people, these communities, these countries are going to be displaced somewhere else, and the international community has to develop a set of responsibilities and expectations for how host countries need to be good neighbors and ultimately take responsibility for those who have nowhere to go. And that's the best place for them to go, at least temporarily. So that's another big international law reality here. So we'll turn things over to Camila to hear about these realities in the Americas.
Is it okay if I stand, actually? Does that work? Thank you. Better with the slides. And Shaya, can I get the clicker from you? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, does this work? Folks can hear me? Awesome. So again, thanks again so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, my first time on GW's campus. So I'm just thrilled to be here and really reflect about those things that, I don't know, I lose sleep over and talk to my students ad nauseum about. And it's nice to do that with colleagues who are bringing such diverse and rich perspectives. I'll move through the first few slides quickly because I think this is all things we've already talked about. I'll just make a quick note here, which is we haven't really talked about the difference between slow onset and rapid onset events. What does that mean? Slow onset is precisely those that move slowly through time, gradual progression. So think drought, sea level rise, ocean acidification, those sort of impacts. And then we have rapid onset, right? Which are the classic flash floods, hurricanes, that sort of thing. The latter get much more attention, right? Because they happen quickly, they get media, they get humanitarian aid sent, and that's all good and fine. But then what happens to the slow onset things that are driving so much of, or multiplying so much of these threats, but don't get as much attention because they're just harder to keep track of. So an important distinction when we're thinking about how to protect people who are affected by sometimes both or one or the other. I won't talk about all the things because we've talked about some of them already, which is there's a gap, right, in legal protection. International law doesn't provide some robust framework for us to really protect those who have to flee their home because of climate or environment. Right, we are living in this refugee convention world, right, post-World War II, that has very narrow set of grounds for protection. Obviously, climate wasn't one that was discussed in 1950. We've talked a bit about the lack of intentionality or the lack of political willingness, right? So that's a massive barrier, and we get to really controversial issues. Climate and migration, right? Like talk about sort of the intersection of a really, really tricky legal issue. And then of course the funding piece, right? There's already a gap, right, between how much money goes into mitigating emissions and actually adapting, which of course we need both, right? This is not a false dichotomy here. But then in terms of migration itself, it's even a wider gap, right? And so that's a huge problem. I think Chaya did a wonderful job at explaining the multi-causality, so I won't get a lot into that. But that's a problem too, because it's just harder to attribute movement to a particular climate event or just climate generally. And then obviously for law, that's super complicated because we love causal chains, right? We love to trace a particular harm to a particular actor or wrongdoer, and that's how our legal frameworks work. This causality has to be often really clear, or at least arguably clear. And here it's much more complicated than that. I will say, to me as a human rights practitioner, the biggest challenge is the racism, the xenophobia, the nationalism that takes over these conversations about climate migration in the mainstream, right? The mainstream conversation. So we're often talking about, or the images that we're told are about this brown and black people coming from the global south to the global north to threaten us, right? Although we know most climate-related movement is actually internal and will be internal. Why? Well, it's expensive to actually leave your country, right? There's visa requirements, you actually have to cross borders. Most people don't have those resources. And those who are doing it, you know, as we've seen from the caravans in the US-Mexico border or the migrants in the Darien jungle in the Panama-Colombia border, it's because they're desperate. So yes, those people are moving, but that's not the majority of people. So again, there's this question about the role that media is playing in the stories we're telling. Who's coming, why are they coming, and this total devoid or whitewashing of the reasons why people are moving in the first place. Here are some, I think, not as bad headlines as there could be, but again, the language we use, right? The stories we tell, the narratives we create. We talk about a crisis, right? Border crisis. We talk about floods of people. We talk about fluxes. We talk about millions and millions, and there's this estimates from 50 to 200 billion, million people who will be displaced by 2050. And all of that is important. We need data, but then what happens to the people who are actually on the move, right? And so there's something here about the way in which we talk about this issue that I find incredibly frustrating. And if you take anything from this presentation is, you know, there's a history here, and we cannot just talk about this without like analyzing the racial components of climate migration. So to highlight a bit of that, I'm gonna uplift the work of a dear colleague, Julia Neusner. She took a bunch of Stanford Law students with her and did some amazing interviews with asylum seekers from Central America and Mexico who were at different shelters. And she was trying to figure out, okay, what's the role of climate here, right? We know climate's shaping movement, but what are people telling us? You know, and of course, it's a complicated story. No one's gonna say, I am moving because climate change made me move, right? As soon as you started the conversations, people would say things like, you know, jobs, insecurity, violence, a better future for my kids, right? Things that intuitively make sense to us. And then, you know, as a good researcher, she would keep going without necessarily leading or having a response that she wanted, but trying to bring other issues to the table. And people would then say, well, you know, actually I was working, you know, as a farmer, and then there was a massive drought. Or, you know, we were in this town, and then the hurricane displaced us. And that made us more vulnerable to gang violence and extortion, and then we fled. So again, these are complicated stories. There's a lot going on here. Certainly climate is part of it. Environment is part of it. But even if it wasn't, and this is the question I get, like, what does climate do? What does the climate lens do for us when we're talking about people have been on the move for millennia, right? Humans move, and this is the story of human civilization. So this is just a quote. I won't read it, but if you've taken a look, it's one of the quotes from one of the interviewees that I think really highlights, again, sort of this complexity, multi-causality, and again, the way in which people tell their stories. And sometimes we have funders, we have think tanks, put this climate change lens, and it's important. But like, what are people telling us? What are they actually saying? And how do we make sense of that? So now I want to talk about a case study I've been spending some time on of Gramalote. So I'm originally Colombian. I spent some time before law school in Colombia doing some research. And I picked Gramalote because it's a very small town, not a lot of people know about it. But it was officially recognized by the president as the first town in Colombia displaced by climate change. Of course, my country, like any country in the equator or in the global south, arguably, is super vulnerable to climate and disaster events. But, you know, this was the first time you had a government official say climate change. It was climate change. Of course, we don't know that, right? It wasn't just climate, of course, because everything we've talked about, there was a lot more here. But I thought that was interesting. There was something here about, again, the human rights obligations or the legal obligations on local and national governments to displace people. So again, this research comes from case law review, 20 interviews with folks who were in the government then or before, disaster risk practitioners, and people who just told me their stories and how the government played a role in trying to address what happened. So 2011, La Niña, massive flooding, rains all across Colombia. It's estimated that 60% of the national territory was affected. Millions of people lost power, had to move temporarily or permanently. Massive, massive event. It was, I think, one of the first times that even the people in the cities were like, oh, like this climate thing. Maybe we should do something about it. Resiliency, adaptation, something. This is a photo of Gramalote. This is what it looked like after the disaster. Most of the town, again, was displaced, except for one informal settlement. And then, the presidency came and said, we will relocate, right? We will relocate you better than before. And so there were these big political promises that were kind of, underlying the whole situation. And so they did. A decade later, the government, with the help of the World Bank and, other institutions, both national and international, including McKinsey consultants, if you're curious, rebuilt the town. And it looks beautiful, right? This is a photo of the main plaza, market plaza. People play, people shop here. Some photos of the reconstructed houses. And the World Bank, to this day, calls this a success story. We have a climate relocation success story, everyone. People are happy, we relocated the town. Of course, now you can hear by my tone of voice, it's more complicated than that. It always is, isn't it? So the legal regime here is interesting because how many people have seen Encanto, the movie, the Disney movie? Okay, brilliant movie, I highly recommend if you haven't seen it. Encanto tells the story of Abuela. Abuela, the grandmother, right, the maternal figure who was displaced due to violence. If you know anything about Colombia, you know that we've had a war for over 60 years or so. Technically, it's over, although it's more complicated than that. We can talk maybe over coffee about what that means. But there's been this entire regime developed for IDPs, internally displaced people. People who have had to move because of the conflict or the violence. There's a special constitutional obligations, there's a special funds for victims, and so on and so forth. Of course, all of that came after massive social movements, right? The government didn't just say, oh, there's an IDP situation here. There was so much advocacy for years and years and years. The government denied we had an internal displacement problem. The internal displacement was so bad that before the current Venezuelan crisis, we had the second highest after Syria, the second highest internal displacement rate in the world. So hugely massive problem. So there's all these legal protections for IDPs in the context of armed conflict. And so what my research is doing is asking the question, okay, what about environmental disasters? Or development projects that have led to displacement, or climate. There's so many other things that lead to displacement. And here the government has used the term damnificado. Damnificado means victim. And I argue that this is problematic because it treats this group of people through a humanitarian lens as, as charity, like, we have to help them. Supposed to, we have we have human rights obligations based on our constitution and international law. So I problematize this and I use Gramalote to show the problems. The Gramaloteros were seen as damnificados. They were, survivors of the disaster, they were victims, but they weren't IDPs, right? Which meant that all of these constitutional protections that are supposed to attach never did. So yes, the town was reconstructed, but participation only came, again, after a lot of input and pushback from the community. There wasn't a human rights-centric approach that guided the process, again, which meant that participation was limited. It meant that, McKinsey and others were making decisions for the future of the town for a long time until actually they kept pushing and said, hey, if we're gonna move here, you need to make sure we wanna move here, right? This basic idea of just get the affected people's voice. So again, I'm here showing you just an example of how through this success story, there's so much more here that we need to problematize from, as lawyers, as activists, as advocates, and how this process, even though it succeeded in relocating the town, took 10 years. 10 years is a long time. A lot of things happened in 10 years. Many people grew and moved away, never came back. People who were kids have now their entire lives elsewhere. And even when people moved back, it wasn't the same town. It was prettier, right? And they had like robust infrastructure, or more than they did so, but that also came with challenges, right? Their neighbor was no longer their neighbor. The entire social fabric of the community had been disrupted. And that's not an easy thing to just, recreate, right? So it's a complicated story. I won't spend a lot of time in this because I think Omar gave us an amazing set of recommendations, to deal with displacement. And again, all of those will depend on what kind of level are we talking about, international, regional, national. But we need to put this on the agenda. It's really, really important. I think ultimately we need permanent legislative solutions. I don't think treating this through the humanitarian lens is going to be enough in the long term, although right now I think we have to. And using existing pathways, right? Especially if we think about all the ways in which people migrate, student visas, worker visas, family reunification, all those things already exist. So are there ways for us to integrate climate into existing policy without needing to, in the US, amend, the Immigration and Nationality Act, which good luck with Congress, getting immigration reform. Lastly, I want to leave you with, again, a beautiful quote. I won't read it, but some of you may know the work of Professor Achume. Professor Achume has written amazing scholarship on migration, international law, and she has this brilliant paper on migration as decolonization. And she really connects the dots for us. She says, people in the first and third worlds are connected. There's a history here, a history of, call it economic exploitation, call it colonialism, racism, you choose, your own adventure. But there's an important history here and connection, and there's a way for us to think about migration. And I like to think of that not just cross borders, but internally too, where there may be some opportunities for migration as decolonization. So if you're interested, look her work up. And one last thing I forgot to mention. So as I mentioned, I had been working with IREP. It's a big international refugee rights organization. And we have launched just 3 days ago, a legal action agenda. So if you're interested, okay, what are the actual pathways, legal mechanisms? You can Google this. It's like a 10, 15-page document that we put together with some academics and other nonprofits. And hopefully, we're trying to create some consensus about all the things that we need to do to protect climate displaced people. So I'll end with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Camila. So we've heard a range of presentations that really give you a sense of the scope and texture of this challenge. And I think some highlights that resonated with me from Camila's remarks was this idea of slow onset versus rapid and what that means for this crisis. I think of course, as the human nature in all of us, we're more responsive to rapid and palpable things, that the slow onset just doesn't get the attention it deserves, which makes this very difficult for the law to address effectively. And so when you think about rapid, it connects to this idea of crisis, and that's what mobilizes human nature, that's what mobilizes the law. And so a lot of that comes to communication, about how we need to communicate what's happening with displacement to convey it as a crisis so that it gets the legal attention it deserves before it's too late. And so when I think about how to frame what's happening with climate displacement as a crisis, the first thing that comes to mind really is we saw how effectively the U.S. mobilized around that perceived and real crisis of the threat of terrorism. We immediately created a new federal agency that was designed to keep us safe. I've often thought about, we need that kind of agency in the U.S. and elsewhere that is committed to climate change-related security and resettlement, whatever we call it. And that's the level of crisis we're talking about with climate displacement. It doesn't feel as imminent to many people as the threat of terrorism may be, but in many ways, when you think about the environmental, the human rights, the political and social dimensions of this, it's absolutely one of the biggest crises we're going to face this century. So characterizing it as such is potentially our most powerful tool. And characterizing that transboundary reality as a national security problem, maybe you're going to get a lot more people's attention. And our Department of Defense here in the U.S., not known for its flaming liberal environmental leadership by any means, Department of Defense was ahead of the curve in reporting about how climate change was a national security threat way back in 2004. So when you get kind of politically powerful institutions and organizations framing a problem as something that requires this crisis level response to, then perhaps we're making more headway. And then, of course, we all care about our own needs as humans, and so the public safety, public health dimension of this crisis could also be another effective hook for the law to intervene. And we've already seen the human rights dimension of it. Unfortunately, that's not getting the attention and respect it deserves, but there are so many layers of human rights challenges with migration. One we haven't talked about yet is the idea of migration with dignity, the idea that there's a whole nother level of the challenge of migration, and that is resettling people in a way that is respectful of who they are as people and cultures. And the human rights lens for the problem would help us get there effectively if that takes hold. So next is Susan.
Well, look, it's an honor for me to be here and to listen to the very stirring, extremely interesting presentations from around the world. I want to support our moderator in suggesting that we're, as a globe, walking into a moral, ideological, existential cataclysm that will require us to take seriously the interrelated destiny of the family of a man. We cannot take this as a separate, clump of national issues around the world. It is a global crisis. And I have great sympathy for the student activists we listened to in the panel before us, facing the smooth face of the status quo wherever you go, and unchanging older people, not reacting, not taking it seriously. That's certainly true in mitigating emissions. It's absolutely true in adaptation. And one of the issues I've really been focused on is the way these legal and financial structures interlock to keep the status quo in place around the world. I want to talk about two deltas that I've been looking at recently to link us back to Kaya's initial discussion of South Asia and Bangladesh. 10 days ago, I was standing in a very small village on the melting fringe of the south coastal region of Bangladesh, and I was interviewing people there. I was led down a narrow brick path that now stands between sort of dilapidated patchwork structures, not the houses the villagers would like to have, but the things that have been thrown up after each succeeding flood. They took me to the end of that brick path, which just stops with a bench next to it. There used to be a kilometer of additional road that's been ripped away by the ferocious Panaguchi River that flows by there. And every time there's a high tide, as it recedes, it drags away more people's homes. They keep rebuilding. They keep finding ways to stay where they are. A woman there who has 3 children told me, but look to your right, keep walking, and you'll really feel sad. I already felt sad. I was led down the road that the car had come in on. The road used to continue 10 additional kilometers across a bay to another ferry stop. That's all gone. The river has washed all of that away, including many agricultural areas, lots of people's houses. It's just gone. And these are middle-class citizens from their perspective and from the perspective of Bangladesh, people who had a livelihood based on what they were growing and doing and making in this area. A government minister had wandered by a few years before and left a few sandbags, but that minister had left office. His government had been kicked out, and nobody cares right now about this region, according to the people I interviewed. And they said the government should care because half the voters have left. Many people have gone to Dhaka, the already ferociously, cataclysmically crowded capital of Bangladesh, where 22 million people live. 2,000 people a day are moving to Dhaka, where the air quality, the last day I was there, was 307. Try to imagine that here on the East Coast. It's like chewing diesel. And you could feel, sorry, I'm choking just thinking about it. You could feel the heat is coming. I heard from many people that it's going to be a very hard summer in Bangladesh with routine fatal temperatures in the city and people working in the middle of the day. Extreme heat, it will cast a great shadow over this country. It's a very crowded place. 170 million people, half the population of the US, in a place the size of Missouri. Very low, very poor, very crowded, very heat. I was served salty water sort of by accident. The villagers, to them, it tastes fine. They've gotten used to it. But incidences of hypertension, miscarriage in women, elaborate series of health consequences from drinking salty water are mounting in Bangladesh, and that water is getting closer and closer to Dhaka, where those 22 million people live. And look, all of this will happen in the United States. I went to Bangladesh just because I wanted to visit the future, because it's already happening there. Migration is extensive into Dhaka, which is not functioning at the moment as a city. National leaders told me that they think of their country like a leaky boat with many, many leaks. It's hard to set priorities, hard to know how to act. The government clearly doesn't have the capacity to help people. And middle-class citizens would like to stay where they are, but are very quickly moving into great areas of conflict in India, which will be very destabilizing for India. Then China will take advantage of this. So I agree with Randy. We're facing a lot of conflict around the world that stems from this. And our moral obligation to help our fellow citizens of this earth is not understood by the legal or financial structures of the world. I gained this perspective really by studying my own country. So Charleston, South Carolina is a distillation of a lot of American tendencies, a place of extraordinary growth, really elaborate growth over the marshes. People just built on fill and trash, creating new land to make a profit. It's also the center of a lot of our dark racial history in the United States, a place where 40% of the enslaved people who first came to America first stepped foot, a place that was the center of plantation culture, a place that continues to just emanate echoes of what is now seen by the white residents of Charleston as a sort of benevolent, paternalistic attitude towards their Black brethren, we know what's good for you people kind of attitude. I spent 4 years interviewing people there and writing a book about it. It's called Charleston, Race, Water, and the Coming Storm. This is a profoundly threatened delta. It's more threatened than the Netherlands, and it has many things in common with the south coast of Bangladesh, that there are people living on the fringes of this area. They're also very wealthy people, but in public housing in Charleston, and in the very lowest areas built on fill of the historic peninsula, there are concentrated areas of poverty, people of color, largely African American, very proud people who deserve to be treated with dignity, who are not being taken into account into the pretty inadequate plans that Charleston has to deal with what's coming. All of this is happening within a very conservative scientific background, tapestry, let's say, that the European Center for Adaptation a couple weeks ago issued a report saying we are not taking into account the extremes that are becoming increasingly likely, especially with pulses of sea level rise arriving way before we're ready for them. We're not ready up and down the East Coast for the 4 to 5 feet of sea level rise that is increasingly likely to arrive by 2070. Many of our cities are built on fill. Many of our residents who are most vulnerable won't be able to just pick themselves up and go to second homes, will be drastically immiserated, frankly, by what's ahead. And in my life in this last couple of years, I've really been looking at the financial and legal structures that are keeping this locked in place. And in America, it's unbelievable how dedicated we are to the status quo. And it rides together with a lot of structures that interlock. Almost every city in America depends on property tax to run its operations, to provide a police department and a public health department and schools. In order to keep property tax going, you cannot talk about the cataclysm to come. You don't want to create a panic. Charleston retains its AAA credit rating for municipal bonds because the bonding agencies and the credit agencies, this is just like the Big Short, by the way, are not looking seriously at climate risk It's not in their interest to do so, and it's expensive to do so, to look clearly into the investments being made to see if they will actually help people or if, in fact, we should be thinking about moving. There are many securities that depend, in turn, on mortgages being paid, mortgage-backed securities, credit default risks, all of those are out there, heavily invested in by high net worth individuals in the United States who don't want to talk about risk too publicly because the whole market would shake. We know that we're walking towards a collapse in coastal real estate in the United States. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but we know it's coming. And I'm increasingly gathering from climate scientists that it's coming in a matter of a couple of decades at most, not far away in the future. And just to bring us back to Bangladesh, people there told me that they had not expected this level of sea level rise and cataclysm in their village during their lifetimes, that it is a surprise to them. Well, it's a surprise around the globe, but we should know better. We should be able to adjust. I was told, look, in America, you have it all. You have land into which you could move. You have rivers that communicate east-south, north-south. You have water that is clean, particularly in the Great Lakes region and in the upper Northeast. If we were able to think in the long term, we would be creating the kind of legal structures that Randy's mentioning. There would be a federal agency whose leader wakes up every morning and worries about this. Right now, following a disaster, 30 federal agencies show up and we start throwing money in all kinds of directions. But there's almost no advanced planning that is actually coordinated among federal, state, and local authorities that is adequately funded to contemplate building dense, transit-connected places with jobs, dignity, places where people will want to move, in advance of the cataclysm to come. So I'm taking this as my life's mission to write about this. I really want to focus people's attention on the financial structures that keep it in place, as well as the legal structures. Takings law in America gets in the way of almost anything we'd like to do that would help people move out of the way. And then our parochial sense that we're not responsible for the rest of the family of man will inevitably have enormous effects on our own economy. So I'm with all of you in the sense of urgency. I think that every law student should be interested in this and should take Randy's class and move forward into the future thinking about how all of these structures need to change with urgency. Unfortunately, it will take a series of crises, not interrupted by too much time, so people don't forget to make these structures change. And it will take a lot of people dying off, probably including me, to make sure that we accomplish the changes that are needed. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was a great wrap-up for these 4 very informative and diverse presentations, and I love the way you connected both the realities of Charleston and Bangladesh, bringing things full circle to where we started in South Asia, and how universal these challenges are and yet distinct. Certainly you hit the nail on the head with the realities of the U.S. and how there needs to just be a sea change of how we operate with what we value and how the law protects it, and how that just has to change radically to protect people and places. And so I think the time has come to hear from all of you. I'm sure you have a lot of questions and comments for our panelists, so let's start the Q&A. Yeah, Rob.
This is a wonderful panel, and I just want to ask one question about, which was mentioned a little bit by Susan, receiving communities. Any thoughts about getting the communities in which people will be leaving to talk to the communities that will be receiving?
Susan?
I'm happy to take it on if
Yep.
you want me to. New Zealand had a great experts report prepared that would do a series of regional efforts to plan ahead for a trigger that would say you've got to move now and then plan ahead for receiving communities. That government got knocked out of office, but it's a great experts report. That's the kind of thing we should be doing here. which is to encourage regional planning so people can stay within their states, and the sharing of municipal tax receipts, so there's a reason to do it. And then we could do the same thing with adaptation that we did in the IRA for emissions reduction. That is, tax breaks, subsidies for developers looking to build and receiving communities. But all of this needs to be accompanied with this profound human rights focus we've heard about: dignity, respect, jobs, wraparound services. This should be treated like hospice care for the communities that are having to lose their people. It's a period filled with grief and torment and a sense of being ripped apart. You need a lot of wraparound services to help people make this transition. So Rob, I'm here to tell you that this doesn't yet exist in the United States. It needs to, and I'm hopeful when Mr. Biden is reelected that there will be this kind of effort on the adaptation front as there has been in the mitigation front.
I really think it's the ultimate planning challenge that we've ever confronted when you think about receiving communities. And I think there's a decent way and a much better way about how it's likely to unfold. And the decent way is something that we've seen in part with the reality of post-Hurricane Maria. So Puerto Rico has a large Puerto Rican community in Orlando. So not surprisingly, there was some refuge for those displaced by Hurricane Maria to resettle, at least temporarily, if not permanently, in Orlando. And that worked. But that's very much of a ad hoc sort of makeshift sort of response to something like this that is likely to recur on many levels from many different vulnerable areas. And so getting further ahead of it rather than that solution is this idea of those communities and states that are interested in being kind of those destinations. So my understanding is Vermont and Minnesota have kind of put themselves out there as potentially destination states for the climate displaced, and I think that needs kind of a national scale of engagement to plan adequately for that, and how the details of that would unfold, because that's a huge undertaking with so many different legal implications involved. But I think that's, to the extent it's starting slowly, that's encouraging, but it's really got to ramp up fast.
I heard the theme about multi-causality and challenge of parsing out threats. And I come from a public health background, particularly in air quality and environmental health. And one strategy that's been really successful in that field is positive externalities. And so spillover effects being beneficial to another field. So I was wondering if there's been any work or if that's an effective approach in this conversation, focusing on the positive externalities from action in housing, action in technology, action in other fields, because this is so intersectional and related to so many different fields of work. So I was wondering if there might be a connection of benefits, a network of benefits.
I mean, I think someone else should speak, not me. Yeah.
So I'm not sure I understood your question fully, but I'll try to address it from one positive, also negative at the same time, that I've seen in this space. So there's something developing which is called immigration in the context of climate change. So there are some immigration laws developing in the European Union where they are allowing people to migrate, voluntarily relocate. And so that may be a positive effect of it in relation to climate-related migration. But I don't think that focuses on the vulnerable communities, because that is also focused on people who have the resources to, say, invest in and to benefit out of that green sort of immigration laws, and to be able to derive benefit from it. So this, I don't know if that relates to what you're asking. There is a positive sort of legal development in this field, but at the same time, it's negative to the vulnerable communities. Yeah.
thanks for the panel. So Professor Bustos mentioned that Colombia has a specific section of the Constitution relating to displacement, which I find really interesting. Obviously, the US doesn't have that kind of section or provisions, but eventually this displacement program will need to be managed by the government. So how do we balance the constitutional provisions of the US with that kind of programs? I know that the takings clause would be an obvious answer, but there's also the privilege and immunities clause that means the right of the persons to move freely among states, and also the due process clause. So how do we make a program that survives judicial review in that aspect, in that sense?
Easy question. Let me just clarify one quick thing. Maybe I misspoke. So the Constitution doesn't say anything about displacement. The Constitution just has a quite progressive set of rights: life, health, water, environment. And from those, plaintiffs have sort of argued in the internal displacement context because of violence that their rights to housing, life, safety, health have been violated. And then the Constitutional Court, through a set of really amazing decisions, has created a jurisprudence for internally displaced people in the context of conflict. Recently, a set of plaintiffs from the islands that are actually closest to Nicaragua, but they're Afro-descendant communities, Raizales communities, have brought some litigation, climate litigation, before the Constitutional Court saying, hey, climate displacement, recognize it. The court, although it adopt some of their human rights arguments, actually declined to recognize climate displacement. Although I think there's room for that in that particular jurisdiction because of our constitutional law. In the United States, I will point you to the next panel. I think there's folks with much more experience about how you would try to bring, again, and have brought or have tried to bring climate-related arguments under the US Constitution. My sense, just from your question, is that we would be looking at administrative law instead, and we would be looking at state law and figuring out programs that could receive maybe FEMA funding, maybe some federal funding, but that are not necessarily based on constitutional arguments, would be my sense. But there's many more experts in the room, so.
About climate change immigration, there is no provision in the most of the constitutions of the world. They talk about the protection for political refugees, but they don't talk about the most important case of the world, which is the immigration as a case of climate change. I think in our constitution in Jordan, we have the Article 21, and in Syrian constitution, they have the Article 34, and the constitution of Iraq have the Article 21, and constitution of Saudi Arabia have Article 42. They talk about the political refugees, but they didn't talk about the climate change immigration or refugees.
So we have time for one last question, but the good news is we have a 45-minute lunch break coming up, so the informal exchange can unfold there. And we need to be back here promptly at 1:15 for our Brodsky Prize ceremony and stay on schedule for our 1:30 panel. So let's go with Robbie again.
Yeah, so yesterday Professor Verchik talked about the no analog future that we're facing, that we're going to be moving into an era in which there's no precedent. And all the panelists just now talked about the kind of on-the-ground physical changes that are likely to occur, and talked about the need for corresponding legal change to be able to accommodate the social changes we need to address this new situation. So anytime there's legal change, there's going to be a lot of litigation. And so efforts to achieve the kind of reforms you're talking about are likely to wind up quite often in the courts. In the US, I don't know about Indian or Jordanian law, the courts increasingly are taking, especially the Supreme Court, a backwards-looking approach in which doctrine after doctrine after doctrine is going to be resolved based upon history and tradition. And the question is, how troubled should we be that the courts in the US and elsewhere are going to sabotage the kind of reforms that you're talking about that we need to achieve to deal effectively with climate migration?
Please.
Yeah. In fact, there are legal organizations dedicated to making property rights and religious freedom rights the center of our legal dialogue and ensuring that they're not tampered with. So your concern is real. I could glibly point to New Zealand, who said none of their administrative steps would be subject to judicial review. They just said, no courts will be involved, we're just going to have this plan. Probably in the United States, that would not work because we really like our judicial review. We all went to law school to do it. So you are right. I believe that Americans at their best are not cynical, even judges. And in the face of an ongoing series of crises that cannot be denied, there will, even in the judiciary, be some acknowledgement that emergency powers are needed, that things need to happen. We see this happen every once in a while, and we're facing one of those. I'm sorry to point to the need for emergency, understanding of these concepts, but that may be our only path.
So with that, let's break for lunch. We've got box lunches waiting in the lobby outside, and we'll see you back here at 12:15.